you very much.
Thank you so much for being here, Wash, and congratulations on this beautiful, thought-provoking, and just wonderfully intelligent film. There's so many things to talk about in terms of Colette and how resonant she is in this era, but let's go back a little bit and talk about how the film came to be, because it started about 17 years ago for you, right?
That's right. The original screenplay was written in 2001, so it took 17 years, which is like a third of my life. So, you know, if it all took this long, it would be, you wouldn't get a lot of films made. But my co-director, Richard Glatzer, and I always felt it would be a great film. And during those 17 years, we were always reworking it. We're always thinking of ways to try and push it out in a different way, refining it. It went through about 15 or 16 drafts. It went through 3 different title changes, a couple of false production starts, and we made 3 other films while we were waiting to make Colette, but it was always our dream project, so it means a lot to finally get it on the screen. And if there's anyone out there with a project that you're a bit stuck on, I'm like, just keep going, because it's good when you finally break through.
It'll come out as amazing as this one. Let's talk about maybe the changes that have gone through the film in terms of the script to this one, because obviously the social cultural moment, the political moment for women in 2001 is different than where we are now. What changed in some ways, Wash?
Well, I think in a way these issues have always been with us, like issues of women and work, issues of women getting credit for work, issues of men keeping women's voices suppressed. And, you know, this film could have found relevance at any time in the last 100 years since Colette actually lived these moments. But it's found particular relevance at the moment with the, you know, final explosion of the cry for justice from women reflected in the Me Too movement and the Time's Up movement. That are very much the same issues that Colette was dealing with 100 years ago, which is just, you know, that male power is just like there to, you know, suppress women's voices, women's economies, and women's lives.
You obviously did so much research on Colette, including the reading, obviously, of her books. What surprised you the most about, or a couple of things that surprised you about Colette in terms of the research you did?
You know, Colette's astonishing, and I hope for many of you this film might be an introduction to learn more about her. She lived enough in her life for like 10 seasons on HBO, no problem. Each marriage she did would actually be an interesting film, and her relationship with her mother could be a whole, you know, it'd probably be a grand opera, actually, because her mother was quite dramatic and possessive. So yeah, when Richard was an avid reader, and he would be reading the books, and he'd go, "Oh my God, you never guess what happened now. She's going on the stage," and like, this is uncanny. It wasn't like going to do Shakespeare in the Park, something they're very respected. It was like the musical. It was like a member of the Kennedy family performing in Las Vegas. It was totally scandalous, and she did it and was very much exiled from her, you know, respectable Parisian elite for doing it. But she did it because it was a way to find a voice. So I think that was a very astonishing thing that initially finding out about her, we're like, wow, she really had balls.
And Willie is obviously a fascinating figure in his own right, and ahead of his time in a different way than Colette was, because he obviously promotions and marketing and branding and that sort of thing for 1903 was sort of extraordinary in regards to how he worked with the stories, right?
You know, he was. I mean, he is a villain, and he's really infuriating, but you have to see that many of the things... I mean, I was always very entertained by... He had a factory, very much like Warhol's factory, where he had lots of people working for him, and then he signed them at the end, you know. But he would provide the initial inspiration for, you know, the books, and then, you know, get other people to do the work. When the Claudine book came out and was such a huge hit, he knew how to capitalize on that. And he did, you know, all these ancillary products: Claudine fans, Claudine soap, Claudine cigarettes, Claudine perfume, there's Claudine photographic paper, Claudine lingerie, and it became this national craze. And I mean, really, it's kind of almost like in the famous thing about the first run of Star Wars is George Lucas made more money off the toys of like Darth Vader and Princess Leia than he did off the movie. And I think it was the same here, that the ancillary merchandise actually generated a huge amount of income for them.
There's also another modern echo as well, which is the fact we see it a little bit when they're in the park at the Bras de Boulogne, and the fact that when Willie and Colette would go to places, they were the biggest celebrities around, and people would notice them wherever they went, right?
They were the celebrity couple of the Belle Epoque. And it was a society of already very notable people and very large personalities, and yet they sort of had that sort of role as like the pair that meant more than the individuals. It was like the Scott and Zelda of the era, or the John and Yoko of the era, or for today probably Kim and Kanye, or Ye, I think he's called right now. But it's like finding out that Kim really wrote the raps for Kanye. So, you know, but they had this electricity, and it was a time when gender roles were really changing in society. And a lot of, you know, very powerful women were starting to speak out in the suffragette movement. And, you know, I think you see this seismic shift in gender roles refracted through the marriage of these two tremendous personalities.
We're going to take some questions from the audience in just a moment. But by the way, let's have a round of applause for Keira Knightley and Dominic West, the film's amazing stars. And let's talk about Keira's entrance to the project. I know it related to her on lots of levels. Her mother was a writer, so she was kind of able to get into the psyche of a writer for the first time in terms of her performances. What was some of those initial meetings like, Wash?
Well, the first meeting was kind of unusual. I was at the Shanghai Film Festival about 3 years ago, and I heard that Keira Knightley had read the script and was interested in talking. She was intrigued, they said. So I was very excited, but then I was also slightly terrified because the internet in China is a little unpredictable.
Yeah.
And at the hotel, I couldn't send any emails. They were all stuck in my outbox, and I couldn't get on any websites or anything. And I was like, how am I going to do this? So it was arranged that I would go to a friend of the festival's penthouse where a party was taking place, and I could use their Wi-Fi in a little side room. So I went to this crazy party, and like Jackie Chan was there and Mike Tyson was there, and I'm like, wow, this is really mad. And then at midnight, I was like sequestered away into this room, and you know, we opened the laptop, and the signal just died, and I was like, oh God, what we're going to do? And we were fiddling around for 5 minutes, and then my phone started vibrating, and Keira had taken the initiative on her own to FaceTime me. So then I'm looking at Keira in the palm of my hand, and she's there, and then I look up at the battery, and it's saying like 15%. So I'm like, okay. So I just started talking about Colette, and the thing about Keira is she has such a lightning speed of comprehension. She's so quick, and we were just firing back and forth about, you know, her ideas about Colette, my ideas about Colette, finding this kind of mutual meeting point. And it was going very well, and then I look up and it's 2% and the battery's flashing red. So I give it the last kind of push, and I say, no one in the world could do this as well as you. And she goes, you know, let's do it. And the phone died. So that's how she signed on. After that, we'd meet up and we'd have cups of tea, and we'd just talk about all the issues in the movie and the style of the movie and the, you know, the way in which Colette would evolve. She goes from 19 to 34. It's 15 years, and that's why I think it's such a tremendous performance of Keira, because you see this woman growing into her own skin as she develops a confidence in her own voice. And you see it not just like the clothes are different, the hair is different, but it's also the body language, and her voice is higher at the beginning and less certain, and it's just the focus in her eyes, just the way she tears Willie apart at the end of the film. And you think who she was at the beginning when she's just there sipping a cup of tea and smiling politely. She's become that person. So we looked actually at Coal Miner's Daughter, the Sissy Spacek movie by Michael Apted, as one of the great on-screen transformations where you see Loretta Lynn go from 14 to 40 without a single date card. And we said, how did she do it? And we just looked at the, you know, the change in body language and personal energy and tried to bring that to Colette.
In terms of body language and sort of the freedom of that era, it's funny because people think about Keira Knightley as somebody who does a lot of period films, thus a lot of corsets. She actually didn't wear a corset for this film in order to give her some sort of freedom of movement. Is that right? As a performer, yeah.
We really thought, you know, of Colette as like when she's running through the woods at the beginning. It's like feral Colette in the woods. She was so connected to nature, so connected to animals and plants and earth and seasons. And when she came to Paris, I think she felt a bit like that bejeweled turtle. She felt like it was a kind of artificial imposition on who she was naturally. So yes, yeah.
Added so much. And Dominic West also gives an amazingly physical performance. Obviously, that great can that he does on the table. But there's sort of an Orson Welles sort of quality that he brings to Willie, where there's a sense of bigness, of grandness, of kind of owning that room and kind of being sort of the center of attention that he loves in so many ways, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the thing that Dominic really got about Willie is Willie's a villain, but if you play him as a villain, the film's going to sort of not really work, because you need to understand why Colette stayed with him for so long. So you see him behaving abominably, but at the same time having this veneer of charm which he uses to get what he wants. And I think a lot of the discussions around at the moment about, powerful men behaving badly, they're not all there with devil's horns coming out of their heads. They often appear very sort of seductive and charming and use all those weapons to get what they want. So the things that were keeping Colette down weren't just sort of economic and social, they were also personal and sexual. Like Willie had this hold over her emotionally. It's very much the truth of the real marriage between Colette and Willie. They spent a long time getting out of it, and she was still very attached to him until the final break happened.
From a directorial point of view, there's a lot of fluidity in the film in terms of just the way the camera moves and the way that Colette is often just she may be in one corner of the frame or the camera may be moving, but we're always aware of her, and she's sort of guiding those moments, right?
Yeah, the theory of it was like Colette moves the camera. It's like Willie has all the words at the beginning because that's who he was. He was taking over rooms with his voice, and he was like the life and soul of the party. But it's always about Colette's point of view. And so it gives her the central focus of the narrative. And we looked at a lot of Max Ophuls films, particularly Earrings of Madame de, for the style. Max Ophuls made a lot of films in the 40s and 50s about the Belle Epoque, and he was actually born in the Belle Epoque, so he was sort of recreating a time that he actually knew. And he had, rather than doing big grand shots, he would follow people for long amounts of time through different sort of planes of different things interrupting the frame that really give you these details about the time. So we tried to get that feel into this film. And also the internal light windows in the apartment were beautiful because in Paris around that time they used these windows to bring daylight into the middle of apartments that would be quite dark during the day. But for us, they gave us a series of frames and boxes that we could kind of hold Colette in these frames within a frame. And I think gave a really nice effect, like when she's writing, you're sort of pushing in, so she's kind of figuring a way to escape her containment that way.
Right, fantastic. I actually, let's follow up on, in terms of other characters, because Missy, both historically and in this film, is so crucial to Colette's next advancement sort of as a person, her sort of self-exploration, and how she kind of plays into the screenplay and what you wanted her to do.
Well, Missy, the Marquise de Mornay, was a hugely groundbreaking person. I'm going to use he because he was male identified, and he was from a very aristocratic background and was able to get away with breaking some serious social norms. Would wear trousers, dress as a man, smoke cigars, use a very kind of male affect in his socialization. And this is at a time before the word trans existed, before the concept of transgender, before even the word lesbian was used. Missy would have been called an invert, which isn't, an identity you want to put on a T-shirt because it implies something's wrong. It's like society not understanding who this person really is. But Missy, I think, was in touch with his authentic self, and this inspired Colette to get in touch with who she really was and what she really wanted. And their relationship lasted for 7 years, and it's interesting that there was a sort of parallel influence on Colette in that time, that Willie's masculinity was very much like, I'm the big he-man, I'm dominating the world. Missy was more about, I know who I am, and I have a self-confidence in that, and I can support someone I love. So it's a different take on masculinity that I think was very supportive and influenced Colette to claim her own voice as an artist.
Yeah, it adds a whole other layer to the film, which is so great. Anybody has any questions, definitely raise a hand. Here's one right here.
Thank you. Hi, I was just wondering about the process of taking what would be a story that's biographical and actually choosing which parts of that person's story should be seen on screen, because she seems to be such a complex person. I don't know if you also were involved with the screenplay itself, but how you were able to actually take, another layer and put that on screen beyond the screenplay.
I was involved in all the drafts of the screenplay, initially with my husband Richard, and then later with a co-writer Rebecca Lenkowitz. And it was really about finding the story. It's about archaeology. Like, you knew there was an beautiful ancient city under there, but there was so much stuff kind of over the story, because there were so many amazing details, both about Colette's life, about the Belle Epoque, about that kind of society. And the earlier versions of the screenplays had quite a lot of little diversions that Colette would go on, like the couple Gaston de Caive and Jeanne de Caive, who are these kind of Proustian Salonites. They, in real life, had a sort of, quite a complicated interaction with Colette that was extended, and that was part of the screenplay at one time. But it seemed too early in the story for her to be hitting that point. We needed to use that to introduce a sort of the idea that there's a window opening, but not fully develop it. And so, as time went on, the story distilled around the principle of it's about the marriage and their relationship within the marriage, and it's about writing, and it's about her discovering that writing gives her a voice. So in the end, the things that were left out were the things that were interesting but didn't kind of contribute to those particular stories.
Just to bounce off that a little bit, it was said a couple of decades ago, actually, Roger Ebert was talking about a movie called Cross Creek, and he was talking about how difficult it is for films to depict a writer writing. And I think this movie does a great job of it, because you really get a sense of watching her sense of invention and her sense of creativity, and watching it come out of herself in a lot of ways. I'm wondering if there was any sort of aspect of the script that was a bit of a challenge that you guys were able to kind of find a key to, because I think it's really done really well here.
Yeah, because, you've seen it a lot of times in films before, where people sit and write, and it's kind of just almost like a space for music to come in, or a space for contemplation. And I think the thing about Colette's writing is it's so central to, it's not just the fact that the words, the stories she is writing, it's the sort of the situation of the writing within the marriage. Like, initially, it's when she first starts writing, I think you see her finding this inspiration from it, and there's a sense of like, when he comes back and he's drunk and she's still up and she's just been writing all day and she's electrified, you sense that she's found this way of communicating her thoughts onto the page, and the excitement of that. Then later, when he locks her up in a room, and which really happened, and she has this choice whether to obey him, submit to him and write, or not. And in the end, she goes to the desk and she picks up the pen. And by doing that, she's both submitting to what Willie wants, but she's also finding her way out of that room, because she's able to, get into, access some kind of cultural power by writing her own thoughts and own ideas. And then in the scene in the third book where he's contradicting her, saying, no, you can't, voice it this way, because it's not very complementary to the Renault character, who is a direct facsimile for Willie. By that time, she's calling the shots. So I think the writing in the film evolves as a way of, you see her strength as a writer and as a person growing through that process.
Yeah, it works narratively and metaphorically and on lots of different levels, yeah. Next question, if anyone has one, shoot up a hand. I want to make sure we get everyone. There was someone in the back.
I used to live in New York in 1992, and I always used to come to the Angelika. It was like my favorite little movie theater, so it's so nice to be here tonight. I used to work at the Telephone Bar. Do you remember that?
Yeah,
on 2nd Avenue.
Avenue.
Yes, I was a busboy.
Yep.
So it's so this is a very important theatre for me, and it's so nice to be here tonight.
Hi, I was curious if you read the books in French, or if you even considered to make the film in French, because you don't fall to the stereotypes about French people. It's very respectful. It's true, because I don't know, you could have had a very British regard to the French at this specific time.
Oh, thank you. May I ask, are you French?
My stepfather was. I lived in France, but I'm from Brazil, actually.
Okay. Yeah, initially, Richard, my late husband, he was fluent in French, and he would read all the Colette in original French. And my French was never that good, so I would be reading in English, and he'd always be telling me how much better the French was. So it started off as a bilingual process. And when we initially went to write, we were very open-minded about whether the movie would eventually end up as an English language film or a French language film. And then about 10 years ago, there was a production of Colette's life that was made for French television by Marie Trintignant, that sort of went all the way through Colette's life. And we kind of thought, well, it's sort of, that's been done. And the thing that would make this project more new and fresh would be to take the story out to an English language speaking audience. So that became our focus from about 10 years ago. But then when you're translating a story from one culture to another, there's lots of decisions you have to make. And it was, you know, one thing is like, why do a French story in English in the first place? And we're like, well, it's because that's the nature of the world, that we're interested in other societies and other worlds, and politicians are always putting up national boundaries to try and divide people, whereas art can actually form connections between different experiences in different countries. And then there's also the sort of culture of French stories in English language, like Dangerous Liaisons, Gigi, Marie Antoinette, Moulin Rouge, and they all take different approaches. And we decided not to go with French accents because we were worried that Willie would sound like Inspector Clouseau. And also, for an English-speaking audience, if you were a French audience watching the film in French, you wouldn't have something in the language telling you these people are from a different country to you. So we used it English, British English, so you could understand class difference and regionality rather than just hearing a sort of French accent over the whole thing. So those were the decisions to translate it, a French story, into English, which, you know, and it also felt like it needed a twist of style to sell, that it was, you know, this sort of slightly fantastical version of France, like a Valentine to Paris.
And in a nice way, it sort of echoes in reading any Colette, because it's obviously translated from the French. So there is sort of this sort of thematic link to it in some ways, right?
There is. And you know, interesting, because Colette's writing was so sensual, some of the earlier translations are a bit, you know, a little bit sort of limited. There's more modern translations now that have a greater honesty about how groundbreaking she was, being one of the first women to write about sexual experiences in such a graphic and sort of personal way.
Well, I'm going to wrap up by asking about the period aspect of it, Wash, and the amazing aspect of recreating Belle Epoque Paris. You know, you sort of think that, you know, it's easy to get a horse and carriage or kind of, you know, dress up a set or an apartment, but it's obviously not. But there's lots of ways to kind of do it. And how did you guys make this film look so beautiful and specific to the time period?
Well, thank you. It was a huge challenge because obviously you think like, oh, Colette, we'll go and shoot in Paris. And then the actual expense of doing that is so enormous and prohibitive. And we, you know, we're on a very tight budget for this film. And we worked out that we could shoot maybe a few days in Paris for exteriors, but we'd shoot the bulk of the movie in Budapest in Hungary. And Budapest actually had a relationship to Paris that they sort of emulated Parisian style towards the end of the 19th century. They have their own Champs-Élysées called Andrássy, and they have their own Moulin Rouge, which was built to copy the Parisian Moulin Rouge. So we had this basis in Hungary, but that was kind of an advantage because there was acres and acres of like rotting aristocratic real estate that had all just been boarded up through communism and no one had touched it. It was like it had the same doorknobs, it had the same wobbly glass, it had the same floorboards. It didn't feel like overly renovated. And the people weren't too precious about us making alterations to it. So we had, in other words, a series of great canvases in which to recreate the Belle Epoque style. When we first did the salon, the standard thing is a big chandelier on the ceiling, but we thought, oh, that's boring. So we had the chandeliers floor mounted so she could kind of walk through them. But if we'd been shooting that in Britain, they would have said someone with a fire extinguisher had to be by every chandelier, because they're really into health and safety, which is a good thing. But in Budapest, they don't care as much, and so so there's all these people waltzing around with all these feather hats and elaborate hairdos and hats, and I just see them whisk through the flames, and I'm like, oh my God, we are really asking for a disaster here. But fortunately, it turned out all right. And we looked at a lot of paintings from that time. There were so many brilliant artists living in Paris, and used the palettes of the paintings and the sort of compositions within the paintings for a lot of inspiration to try and get the real feel of the times.
The film itself is inspirational. So many great canvases, so many great ideas. Ladies and gentlemen, watch Westmoreland, and the film is Colette.
Thank you.
Wash. Thank you so much.